Hello everyone, welcome to the first recording of Firms and Markets. I hope that you're all doing well. There are two building blocks of every economic analysis. The first block is the demand side, which refers to the buyers, and the second block is the supply side, which refers to the sellers. In this recording, I'm going to explain you the most fundamental concepts about the demand side of the market. Let's begin. When we talk about the demand side of the market, we're going to represent our ideas using a market demand curve. A market demand curve is a curve that shows us the total quantity demanded in the entire market at any given would-be market price. The market demand curve in most of the markets is downward sloping, which basically captures the idea that all else equal, which is an important condition, if the sellers reduce the price of the product, the demand for their products would increase. There's a negative relationship. Let's look at the mathematical representation of these ideas. On the left-hand side, I have a demand curve, and let's suppose that this is the demand curve for breakfast cereals. On the y-axis, we have the price, and on the x-axis, we have quantity. When the price of this breakfast cereal is about 20 pounds, which is a little bit on the expensive side, the demand in the market is about 50 units. Here you can think about in terms of millions. And when the sellers reduce the price from 20 to 5 pounds, as you can see, the total quantity basically goes all the way up to 500. The demand curve, as you can see from this example, is downward sloping. As the sellers reduce the price, quantity demanded increases. This is a pattern that we observe in most of the markets, but not necessarily in all. Learning economics is a bit like learning a language, right? In languages, there are certain systematic patterns, and we try to understand them and learn about them. While there are those systematic patterns in languages, then there are always also some exceptions. Economics is exactly the same. There are certain systematic patterns that we observe that hold in most of the markets, but then there are always some special cases. So this all means that there are, of course, some special cases in which the demand can be upward sloping. Here are some examples. A good example of a market with upward sloping demand function is a market where consumers use price as a signal of quality. So why do they do that? Well, consumers may use price as a signal of quality when they're uncertain about the quality of the underlying product. A perfect example for this is the private healthcare market. So ex ante, you don't necessarily know the best doctors, right, or the best clinics, the private clinics, and you may use the price as a signal of the quality of the clinic. A second example of markets with upward sloping demand functions are the markets where price might be used as a symbol of social status by its market participants. A good example for this type of markets is a high-end arts market. The market participants in these arts markets, right, as the price actually goes up, the demand for these type of products may actually increase. A fundamental concept in demand is the price elasticity of demand. It basically means how sensitive the consumers are to the changes in prices. Let me give you the formal definition. As you can see on the slides, price elasticity of demand is defined as percentage change in demand divided by the percentage change in price. So when you calculate this ratio for many markets, you will obtain a negative number. And this is because, as I mentioned before, the demand is downward sloping for most of the markets. So the economists, right, when they're defining the price elasticity of demand, they decided to multiply this ratio by a negative number, by -1. They do that because when they talk about price elasticity of demand, they want to talk in terms of positive numbers as opposed to negative numbers. For some reason, right? People generally get confused severely, actually, when they talk in terms of negative numbers. So to make the life easy for everyone, including themselves, economists basically decided to multiply this ratio by -1. So what does price elasticity of demand indicate? So if elasticity, this ratio, is higher than 1, we generally say as a rule of thumb that the demand is price elastic. And if this elasticity ratio is less than 1, then we say the demand is generally price inelastic. Next, I want to talk about the economic factors that may influence the price elasticity of demand. So when we calculate the price elasticity of demand in different markets, we see huge amount of variation. Sometimes the demand can be very elastic and sometimes quite inelastic. So let's think about the factors which might explain such variation. There are a number of reasons that may influence the price elasticity of demand. The first one is the availability of substitutes. As substitutes, the more available the substitutes are, that increases the price sensitivity of demand. If we go back to our example in the beginning, the breakfast cereal, if the cereal producers increase the price of the cereal, right, people can easily switch to alternatives. Suppose eggs, for instance, or even rice in some cultures. Because the availability of substitute is there, then this will basically make individuals, households, more price sensitive. Another factor that influences the price elasticity of demand is wealth constraint. Of course, as you can imagine, individuals who are more wealth constrained are going to be more price sensitive. A third factor is the necessities. Put it differently, the nature of the product. If the product is an essential good, is a necessity for our lives, right? Immediately, this will make us less price sensitive. A good example for this, I think during lockdown especially, will be electricity, for instance, or Wi-Fi, right? This is an essential product for our lives. So of course, we're not going to be very price sensitive. And other things that may also influence the price elasticity of demand include things like branding, marketing, and customer loyalty. They all go in the same direction, meaning that, for instance, when a firm has built a very strong brand, because now the customers have a taste for this brand, they become less price sensitive. And also switching costs. Sometimes the firms may intentionally generate some switching costs. We see this a lot in tech firms, right? When they come up with certain products, they design them in a way that those products only work with certain softwares, for instance. Then once the customer then commits to one type of software, then it becomes kind of a hassle to switch over to an alternative one. And then this will automatically reduce the customer's price elasticity of demand. And finally, one important factor that will influence the price elasticity of demand is the time horizon. Generally speaking, our demand functions are more inelastic in the short run, but it can become more elastic in the long run. And this is because sometimes it may basically take time for people to change their habits or adjust their consumption baskets. I want to close this discussion by just showing you the mathematical representation of different types of demand functions, inelastic versus elastic demand functions. As you can see from this graph, on the left-hand side, I have an example of an inelastic demand curve, and on the right-hand side, I have an example of an elastic demand curve. The more inelastic the demand curves are, as you can see, the steeper it will appear. And the more elastic the demand function is, it is more relatively flat. So why is that? Well, to understand it, let's just run a very quick thought experiment. On the left-hand side, let's take this graph. If the price is at this point, is its maximum point, right, the demand is basically 0. If we reduce the price by half in this particular graph, right, let's look at it. It's reduced from, say, £10 to £5. the quantity reaction that we get to it is from 0 to this point, the midpoint here. It's relatively small. If you do the same exercise here, so again 10 pounds for instance here, and the producers decide to reduce it by 50%, it goes to the midpoint. Let's look at the demand reaction to it. It's a huge quantity response, as you can see. Because of that, right, as you can see from the simple exercise, the more elastic the demand function is, the more flat it will look, and the more inelastic the function is, the steeper it will appear. Thank you very much.